The night began with Emma Matthews lying quietly on her hospital bed, pretending to be deeply asleep while her son and daughter-in-law whispered only 3 feet away. She listened as David murmured, "We need to hurry. The pills are too slow." His wife, Linda, leaned closer and whispered, "Then we finish it at home tonight. Fire will look natural." Emma kept her breathing soft and steady, though her heart beat like a drum in her chest. Everyone believed a 72-year-old billionaire couldn't hear well, but Emma heard everything. And in that moment, she understood that her own family wanted her dead. Emma stared at the ceiling, recalling the empire she had built from her garage in 1987, using nothing but stubborn faith and a borrowed computer. She had grown her company, Sunrise Technologies, into a powerhouse, sold it for billions, and kept enough shares to live forever in peace. But David had always been a restless child, hoping money would solve his problems instead of effort. And Linda, a former pharmaceutical worker, knew too much about drugs that could mimic old age. Emma listened as Linda whispered, "She could live another 10 years at this rate." David sighed heavily, replying, "Then we can't wait anymore." Emma realized her silence was now her greatest weapon. Later that evening, David helped Emma into her bedroom with the gentleness of a loving son, even though she knew the truth behind his soft voice. "Rest well, Mom," he said quietly, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. Linda brought tea, placed it carefully on the nightstand, and kissed Emma's forehead like a caring daughter. "We're going out for dinner, Grandma Emma," she announced sweetly. "We'll be back soon." Emma watched their silhouettes leave the room, watched their car disappear down the road, and the moment they were gone, she opened her eyes. "You chose the wrong woman to underestimate," she whispered as she reached for her secure phone. Emma dialed her private security line and spoke calmly, "This is Emma Matthews. I need fire and police at my home immediately. Code 7. Code 7 meant family threat, imminent danger. She then gathered every piece of evidence she had hidden away, fake medication bottles, insurance papers David and Linda secretly filed, and proof of her son's massive gambling debts. By the time she heard footsteps returning to the porch, she had reconnected all the smoke detectors they had disabled. She also placed herself calmly in her favorite chair, ready to meet them with strength instead of fear. The old Emma they remembered was gone. A fighter sat in her place. David opened the front door expecting to see smoke and ashes, but instead, he froze at the sight of Emma sitting upright between Fire Marshal Jordan Hayes and Detective Lisa Grant. His voice trembled as he forced a smile. "Mom, thank God you're safe. We smelled smoke from the street." Emma folded her hands gently and replied, "How thoughtful, especially since you two poured gasoline around my house." Linda tried to laugh it off, waving a dinner receipt. "Emma, sweetie, you're confused," she insisted. But the fire marshal stepped forward and said firmly, "We found accelerant around your home. Someone wanted the person inside to die." David's face drained of color as Detective Grant opened her notebook and spoke calmly. According to Emma, she saw 2 people pouring liquid from red containers around 8:15. Linda quickly shook her head and said, "We were at dinner. You can ask anyone at the restaurant." Emma smiled softly at her. "Yes, dear. I know you tried very hard to be seen there." She leaned forward just enough for her voice to carry. "But tell me, how did you eat dinner, drive 45 minutes home, attempt a fire, and still have time to smell smoke from the street?" David swallowed hard, unable to answer a single word as the silence pressed around him. Detective Grant laid new documents on the table, her voice steady and cold. "Mr. Matthews, we have records of your recent $2 million gambling debt." Linda stared at the paperwork in shock before turning to David. "You said it was handled," she hissed under her breath. Emma lifted her eyebrows calmly. "Yes, David. How motivating debt can be when your mother has $3 billion. Fire Marshal Hayes then held up an evidence bag containing a gasoline container. "Fresh fingerprints," he said. Linda's expression shifted instantly from fear to fury as she snapped, "You old witch, you've been spying on us." Emma replied evenly, "Lucky for me, since you've been trying to kill me." The tension in the room tightened as Detective Grant stepped closer to Linda. "Ma'am, are you denying you added medication to Emma's food?" Linda stiffened and said sharply, "She's confused. She needs medical help." Emma rested her hands in her lap and spoke gently. "Oh, you mean the digitalis? Yes, I have blood tests, hair samples, and video of you adding it to my tea." David's voice cracked as he tried one last lie. Mom, the medication was for your heart. Emma turned to him slowly. What heart condition, David? I've never had one. The truth hung in the air like thunder before Detective Grant said, both of you need to come with us. By the next morning, reporters crowded outside Emma's home like a storm that refused to move. Headlines everywhere read, Billionaire Grandmother Survives Murder Plot. Emma made coffee and watched the commotion through her kitchen window, feeling strangely calm. Her attorney, John Parker, arrived looking overwhelmed. Emma, this media situation is exploding, he said. She handed him a mug with a faint smile. Good. I want David and Linda to understand exactly what they lost. John sighed and opened his briefcase. They're being charged with attempted murder, arson, and conspiracy. Linda also faces drug charges. She stole the digitalis. Emma nodded firmly. Then let the law handle them, John. They handled nothing but greed. Emma's neighbors began to arrive with casseroles, cookies, and worried expressions, turning her quiet kitchen into a room full of voices. Mrs. Rivera placed a dish on the counter and whispered, We always knew something was off about those two. Mr. Harvey added, Your son never came unless he wanted something. Young Anna from next door stepped forward shyly and said, I recorded some of their arguments. They were really loud. Should I give the recordings to the police? Emma touched her arm gently. Yes, dear. Thank you. When Detective Grant returned 20 minutes later to gather all the new evidence, Emma felt something unexpected settling over her chest, relief. For the first time in months, she wasn't alone. That afternoon, John called Emma with an update that made her pause mid-sip of tea. Emma, the judge scheduled the bail hearing for tomorrow morning, he said. The prosecutor is requesting $2 million each. Emma chuckled softly. They don't have $2 million. That's why they tried to kill me. John hesitated before saying, David is still your only child. Emma stared out the window at the cluster of reporters and replied, A child who tried to burn his mother alive is not a child anymore. She set the phone down slowly, knowing tomorrow would decide far more than just bail. The courtroom the next morning was packed so tightly that even the air felt tense. Emma entered wearing her deep navy suit, moving with dignity as reporters whispered her name. David and Linda sat at the defense table, far from their former polished selves. David looked pale and shaken, while Linda glared at Emma with eyes full of cold calculation. Prosecutor Taylor stood and addressed the judge. Your Honor, these defendants deliberately poisoned and attempted to kill Mrs. Matthews for financial gain. The judge listened quietly, her expression firm. Emma could feel the eyes of the entire room on her. When the judge asked if Emma wished to speak about bail, she rose slowly, using her cane with practiced grace. Your Honor, she began, her voice steady, I spent 40 years building a company that gave jobs to thousands. I raised my son alone after my husband died. I stood by him through every failure. She looked directly at David, whose eyes fell to the table. They repaid my love by trying to murder me for money they were too lazy to earn. The courtroom held its breath. Your Honor, these people saw an old woman as easy prey. They were wrong. Then she sat, leaving a silence sharp enough to cut. The judge reviewed the paperwork with slow, deliberate movements. Then she lifted her head and said, Bail is set at $5 million each. Gasps filled the room. David slumped back as if the air had been punched out of him. Linda whispered something furious under her breath, her face twisting in anger. The officers approached, placing handcuffs back on both defendants. As David stood, he dared to whisper, Mom, please. But Emma met his eyes without a flinch. Actions have consequences, David, she said. He lowered his head as he was led away, leaving Emma feeling both victorious and heartbreakingly hollow. When Emma returned home, she expected silence, but once again neighbors appeared at her door carrying homemade food and quiet comfort. Mrs. Rivera placed another dish on the counter and said, We're not letting you face this alone. Emma gave a tired smile. It seems I had more family around me than I knew. Detective Grant arrived soon after to collect additional recordings Anna had found. This evidence strengthens the case significantly, she explained. Emma nodded, though a growing heaviness pressed against her chest. Detective, she whispered, I never imagined my life would become this. Grant replied gently, Sometimes survival reveals the truth we were never meant to ignore. 2 days later, Emma walked through the empty shell of David's foreclosed home to collect belongings she had stored there years ago. Movers carefully loaded trunks when one of them approached her with a sealed envelope. "Ma'am, we found this in a safe." Inside was a handwritten note from David that read, "I can't do this anymore. She's my mother. Find another way." Emma stared at the message for a long moment. "Too late, my son," she whispered. "Far too late." She folded the letter and slipped it into her coat, unsure whether it eased or deepened the ache in her chest. Detective Grant called her later that evening with unsettling news. "Emma, Linda is trying to strike a deal. She's blaming David for everything." Emma closed her eyes slowly. "Of course she is." Grant continued, "She's also claiming you controlled them financially and that David was terrified of disappointing you." Emma let out a long breath. "Detective, I have 3 decades of records proving every penny I gave them was out of love, not control." Grant said, "The prosecutor wants to see all that documentation. Linda is trying to paint you as the manipulator." Emma straightened her spine. "Then we will show them the truth." The next morning, Emma arrived at the prosecutor's office carrying binders, recordings, and years of carefully organized documents. Prosecutor Taylor spread everything across a long conference table. "Emma," she said, amazed, "this is extraordinary. You documented every financial interaction." Emma nodded carefully. In the tech world, documentation keeps the wolves away. They listened to recordings of David begging for money, recordings of Linda discussing medications, and notes Emma had written whenever something felt wrong. Taylor leaned back and said, "This shows a clear pattern. Not of control, but of generosity taken advantage of." Emma exhaled deeply, feeling something inside her loosen. Then Taylor played the recording Emma hadn't yet heard, David and Linda inside their car. Linda's voice was cold. "Another dose, and she won't be able to sign anything." David sounded panicked. "This is murder." Linda replied sharply, "No, it's survival. She's old, she's alone, and she's in our way." Emma pressed a hand to her chest. Hearing her son discuss her death made her breath tremble, but she kept her posture strong. Taylor placed a hand on her arm. "These recordings will decide the trial." Emma nodded slowly. "Then let them hear every word," she whispered. "Every single one." As Emma left the prosecutor's office, she paused on the sidewalk, watching cars move through the city she had helped shape with her work. Tomorrow the trial would begin, and with it, the end of the story she once thought would include her family. 40 paragraphs, she murmured to herself, and a lifetime of lessons. She knew the courtroom would reveal truths she had tried to ignore for years. She also knew she was strong enough now to face those truths without breaking. With a deep breath, she whispered, "Let the ending come. I'm ready." Then she stepped into her car, prepared for the fight that would define the rest of her life. The courthouse was already crowded when Emma arrived the next morning, escorted gently by John. Reporters shouted her name from behind the ropes, but she kept her eyes forward, her steps steady. Inside, she saw David sitting at one table, staring at the floor, while Linda sat at another, looking polished and innocent in a soft blue dress. Prosecutor Taylor approached Emma and whispered, "Stay calm. We have everything we need." Emma nodded slowly, reminding herself that truth had its own power. When the judge entered, the room fell silent, signaling that the final fight had begun. Prosecutor Taylor opened with a voice filled with quiet fire. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is a story of greed so deep it turned a family into predators." She played the first recording, the one where Linda whispered, "Fire will look perfect." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Then came the recording of David saying, "This is murder," and Linda answering, "It's survival." Emma watched David bury his face in his hands, shaking. Linda, however, kept her posture straight, her expression carefully blank. Emma wondered whether Linda even felt fear anymore, or if she only understood strategy and survival. David's lawyer attempted damage control, standing quickly. "Your Honor, these recordings lack context," he argued. "My client is a troubled man, not a murderer. He was manipulated by his wife." The judge listened, her face unreadable. Linda's lawyer stood next, pointing boldly at Emma. "Mrs. Matthews orchestrated this chaos," he claimed. "She poisoned herself to frame them. She controlled them financially for years. Emma felt a flicker of anger, but kept her expression calm. Prosecutor Taylor rose again and said sharply, "We have medical reports, fingerprints, debt records, and neighbor testimonies. The evidence speaks louder than lies." Then Emma took the stand. She spoke slowly, clearly, every word deliberate. "I raised my son alone. I paid for his school, his wedding, his home. I gave without holding anything over him." She described the dementia-like symptoms she had felt while being poisoned. She described waking up to see gasoline being poured around her home. The jurors leaned forward, their eyes fixed on her. When asked what she felt hearing her son plan her death, Emma paused and said softly, "I felt heartbreak first, and fear second." Even David bowed his head, unable to lift his eyes to meet hers. Linda's attorney cross-examined with a sharp smile. "Mrs. Matthews, isn't it true you recorded private conversations without permission?" Emma replied calmly, "I recorded to protect myself." "He stepped closer. Or to control your son." She replied, "If I wished to control him, I would not have spent 30 years giving without receiving." He frowned and asked, "Did David ever ask you to stop helping him financially?" Emma shook her head. "Never." He spread his hands dramatically. "Then you created dependence, didn't you?" The courtroom murmured, but Emma stayed steady, knowing Prosecutor Taylor would dismantle the accusation. During the break, Emma sat quietly in a small waiting room while John poured her a glass of water. "You handled yourself well," he said. Emma nodded without speaking, feeling the weight of the years pressing against her shoulders. "John," she whispered, "I don't want revenge. I want truth." He sat beside her gently. "Then truth is exactly what we will give the jury." Outside the door, reporters swarmed, but inside, Emma held her hands together and repeated softly, 40 paragraphs. "Let this end with dignity." The break ended, and she walked back in, ready to finish her part. After lunch, Prosecutor Taylor called their final witness, Dr. Foster, the toxicologist. He stepped up confidently and explained the digitalis levels found in Emma's system. "She would have died within weeks," he said. "This was a deliberate and gradual poisoning." Linda's lawyer tried one last desperate angle. Could she have poisoned herself? Dr. Foster raised an eyebrow. "Digitalis poisoning requires precision. No 72-year-old woman would secretly poison herself for months while staging her own arson scene." Laughter rippled softly through the courtroom, but the judge quickly restored order. Emma watched Linda's mask finally crack at the edges. Then came the most dramatic moment of all, the final recordings. Prosecutor Taylor played the last conversation, where Linda said sharply, "She's old. She's in our way." The jury froze. Reporters scribbled furiously. David covered his face again, whispering, "What have I done?" Emma felt her throat tighten, but she kept her gaze forward. Linda stared ahead with cold eyes, refusing to show fear. For the first time, Emma realized something painful but true: Linda had never loved David. He had been a tool. And Emma had been an obstacle. That understanding settled over her like a stone. The closing arguments began with Prosecutor Taylor stepping forward firmly. "This was not a moment of weakness," she said. "This was a plan. A plan built on greed, executed with cruelty, and ended only because Mrs. Matthews was stronger than they expected." She gestured to the evidence table. "They poisoned her. They plotted to burn her alive. They insured her life for millions. They deserve accountability." Then David's lawyer argued his client's regret and fear. Linda's lawyer insisted she was innocent and manipulated. But the courtroom energy had shifted. Emma could feel the jury's minds settling like stones. When the jury left to deliberate, Emma sat with her hands resting on her lap, breathing slowly. John whispered, "Whatever happens, you've already won. You survived." Emma nodded, though her heart felt heavy. "I just want the truth recognized," she said softly. Hours passed in quiet tension until the bailiff announced, "Verdict reached." Emma stood, steadying herself with her cane. As she walked back into the courtroom, she looked at David and Linda one last time. She wasn't angry anymore, only tired. The ending was coming, and she was finally ready for it. The courtroom fell into a hush as everyone took their seats again. Emma gripped her cane gently, feeling the weight of decades pressing against her chest. The forewoman of the jury stood, holding a folded sheet of paper. The judge nodded for her to speak. On the charge of attempted murder in the first degree, the forewoman said clearly, "We find the defendant, David Matthews, guilty." A tremor passed through the room. Emma inhaled slowly as the verdict continued. On the same charge for the defendant, Linda Matthews, guilty. Emma closed her eyes for a moment, letting the truth settle like steady rain. The judge asked the jury to continue. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, the forewoman read, "Guilty for both defendants." Reporters scribbled wildly. The judge motioned for silence. On the charge of arson in the first degree, the forewoman paused, "Guilty." Linda's jaw tightened, but she kept her stare fixed ahead. David whispered, "Mom, I'm sorry," tears falling from his eyes. Emma looked at him with sorrow instead of anger. "Sorry came too late, David," she said softly. "But I hope you learn from this." Linda, however, glared without remorse, even as officers stepped forward to restrain her. As the courtroom emptied, Prosecutor Taylor approached Emma. "Justice was served today," she said gently. Emma nodded but kept her gaze on the doorway where David had disappeared moments earlier. "Justice," Emma murmured, "is not the same as joy." John placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You survived, Emma. That matters." She gave him a tired smile. Outside, cameras flashed like lightning. Reporters called her name, but she simply walked to her car, whispering, "Let this be the final chapter." She was ready for silence, ready to rebuild, ready to breathe again without fear. That night, alone in her hotel room, Emma finally allowed her emotions to rise. She sat by the window overlooking the glowing city and let quiet tears fall. Not for justice, not for relief, but for the son she thought she had, not the man he had become. "I wasn't blind," she whispered. "I just hoped he would change." The room felt heavier than usual, filled with memories she didn't know how to carry anymore. But after a long moment, she wiped her face gently and whispered, "Tomorrow will be mine again." The city lights shimmered like a silent promise. The next morning, Detective Grant called with one final update. "Emma, sentencing is confirmed for next week. The prosecutor will seek life without parole for both defendants." Emma sighed softly. "Let the court finish its work," she replied. Grant hesitated. "Emma, you should know something. David asked if you would visit him." Emma closed her eyes. "No," she whispered. "I carried him for 9 months. I carried him for 40 years. Now he must carry what he chose." Grant responded gently, "I understand." Emma thanked her and ended the call, letting the quiet settle again. A week later, Emma stood before her new home, a peaceful house near the sea, far from the noise of her old life. She stepped onto the back deck and listened to the ocean waves crashing like a heartbeat beneath the sky. Her neighbor, Mrs. Ellis, walked over with 2 glasses of lemonade. "New beginnings," she said with a warm smile. Emma took the glass and replied, "Yes. And quiet ones." Mrs. Ellis sat beside her. "No family visiting?" Emma shook her head gently. "No. But peace is better than company that tries to kill you." They shared a small laugh that felt like healing. Days turned into weeks as Emma adjusted to her new routine: morning walks, quiet afternoons, evenings filled with books and soft music. She discovered she enjoyed her own company more than she ever expected. One afternoon, Mrs. Ellis joined her by the water and asked softly, "Do you ever regret fighting back?" Emma looked at the horizon before answering. "Regret? No. Pain? Yes. But survival is not something you apologize for." Mrs. Ellis nodded. "You're stronger than most people I know." Emma let the wind brush her face. "Strength is born when love fails you," she replied. On the day of the sentencing, Emma didn't attend the hearing. Instead, she sat on her deck, sipping tea while listening to the distant cry of seabirds. Her phone buzzed with a message from John, "Life without parole." Both of them. Emma read it twice, then placed her phone down gently. The ocean breeze brushed her hair as she whispered, "It's done." She felt no triumph, only closure, a door quietly clicking shut after too many years. She lifted her cup and murmured, "Goodbye, David. Goodbye, Linda." The waves carried the words away as if understanding their weight. That evening, as the sun slid into the sea, Mrs. Ellis joined her again. "Any regrets today?" she asked kindly. Emma thought for a long moment before answering. Only one, she said. That I didn't realize sooner how strong I truly was. Mrs. Ellis smiled gently. Strength isn't measured by the battles you avoid, but by the ones you survive. Emma nodded, feeling the truth settle warmly in her chest. I survived my family, she whispered. And now I choose my peace. The horizon glowed gold, as if offering her a quiet blessing. As darkness settled over the water, Emma raised her glass in a silent toast, to the woman she used to be and the woman she had become. She whispered, survivor, fighter, free. She knew she would never forget what had happened, but she also knew she would no longer live in its shadow. Her story had begun in fear, but it ended in strength. And as she watched the final shimmer of daylight fade into the calm ocean, she realized something powerful. The people who wanted her gone had only taught her how to live better. With a steady breath, she closed her eyes and embraced the quiet, knowing the rest of her life finally belonged to her. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me your thoughts in the comments below. I love reading your reactions.